Introduced for the 1960 model year and running through 1969, Chevrolet's Corvair was one of the quintessential cars of the 1960s, with Chevrolet selling almost 1.8 million units over that period of time. Now, the Corvair initially was quite popular. In fact, in 1961, 1962, it was selling over 300,000 units, before tapering off in sales to the point where by 1969 it was selling around 6,000 units in total. But for a number of years, particularly before Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed was published, the Corvair was an extremely popular and quite remarkable car for the time in many ways. Now, during the time frame that the Corvair was developed, Ed Cole was the leader of Chevrolet. And Cole had worked his way up through the engineering ranks at General Motors. He was perhaps most famous for working on the Cadillac overhead valve V8 that was introduced for the 1949 model year and the Chevrolet small block that was introduced for the 1955 model year when he was Chevrolet's chief engineer. But by this point, Cole had kind of found himself in the general manager's chair of Chevrolet, and he had some really unique ideas. One of which was to convert the entire lineup of Chevrolet full-size cars to rear transaxle vehicles. In other words, the transmission would be shifted to the rear of the car where the drive wheels were. This was one of Cole's ideas, as I said, for even the full-size cars, and unfortunately it didn't come to fruition, largely because of cost and also reliability concerns. But Cole's desire in moving the transmission rearward was to give passengers in vehicles much more space. There would be no transmission hump, and the remaining hump could be much smaller because the portion of the floor pan that had to be cut out for the drive shaft could be much smaller, because the drive shaft would only need to transmit the engine's torque to the rear and not take into account the torque multiplication effect of the transmission's torque converter when transmitting that amount of torque to the rear transaxle. Now, General Motors would produce a rear transaxle car. That would be the 1961 and for a few subsequent years, Pontiac Tempest. Those vehicles did have the transaxle at the rear. And of course, Chevrolet would come out with its Corvair in 1960 that not only had the transmission in the rear, but also had the engine in the rear. A novel for the time, at least from a General Motors standpoint, not necessarily from an international standpoint, air-cooled, six-cylinder, flat six, I should say, engine. In fact, that air-cooled rear-mounted engine was extremely popular on a car that was gaining momentum from a sales perspective during this time, none other than the Volkswagen Beetle. And Cole really wanted to develop a car that could compete with the Beetle and be an affordable vehicle for families that they could carry whatever they wanted in it. But at the same time, it had a little bit of sporty flair, kind of like a Porsche. Hence what the Corvair ended up being with its six-cylinder air-cooled engine, as opposed to something like the Beetle's four-cylinder air-cooled engine. Now, the Corvair was a cool car, and I have to say the 1960 to 64 is a handsome Corvair style, I would say, but the 1965 to 1969 is just, well, takes it to a whole new level. I love the 65 to 69 styling, whether it's front or the rear, as you see here, or the side profile. They all look excellent. There's not a bad angle on that latter Corvair. But there was a Corvair, and I would say a 1960s era General Motors car that GM should have produced, but unfortunately did not, and that is the awesome 1962 Corvair Monza GT Concept that you see here. Now, this Corvair Monza GT Concept is really credited to two main designers. That is Larry Shinoda, who would later go on to work for Ford and be responsible for the Boss Mustang design. While he was at GM, he also worked on the Stingray Corvette and, of course, this vehicle, among others, and Tony Lapine. Tony Lapine would later go on to become head of Porsche design. So this was the early years for both of those designers, and they certainly constructed an absolutely beautiful body for this vehicle. Take a look here at this front view, and you notice the gorgeous surfacing that this car has. This car, by the way, was on display at the Eyes on Design car show in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which occurs every Father's Day. I highly recommend you check it out. It's one of my favorite car shows, probably my favorite car show of the year that I go to. In any case, I love the front end surfacing of this car. Obviously, it has the super long hood with the pointy beak up front, hidden headlamps, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then you have these beautiful fender bumps. Look at that surfacing, how it just gradually transitions from the hood into the fender. And then you have a beautiful crease that runs atop the fenders and loops around to the front of the hood and continues rearward on the car as well. The surfacing also is kind of this early style design, I would say, where the designers were trying to integrate the windshield and the side glass into one overall continuous form for the car, kind of a canopy style front glass area, which we're going to talk more about in a second. But it's so beautiful and so integrated that you almost miss the fact that this car has no A-pillars at all. It's just a complete canopy of glass up front. In fact, take a look at how the midsection of the car opens completely and is hinged such that a driver and passenger can enter and you have a completely unobstructed area to enter into. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here is there's that crease that runs along the entire hood line, starting at that front point, goes all the way up the vehicle, including on the windshield and up onto the roof. It's just this continuous, unbroken line that gives the car some overall tension. Yeah, I'll also point out that that painted portion up top that looks like it's a metal roof is actually not. It's actually a painted glass or plexiglass surface. I didn't touch the car to determine what that material actually was that's forming the windshield and the side glass. I'm assuming it's some sort of plexiglass, but I don't really know, to be honest. You're not going to touch one of these priceless cars, and there's nobody around to ask. In any case, it is actually painted, though. It is not a sheet metal roof. And what is under that canopy? Well, nothing other than a full silver lame style interior here. Notice everything is coated in this shiny silver-like vinyl, and it encompasses not only the seats, but also the side portion of the interior, kind of similar to aircraft. You can imagine that the designers here were likely thinking that it showcased the overall safety of the interior, because if you bumped into anything, it was padded, including the center console there, which has the same material. Even the shifter boot is made of the same material, only the IP is black. Everything else in this interior, I guess the seat belts are also black, but everything else is that silver color. You can also tell here that the seat is in a fixed position. The pedals actually move. So this was something that GM did on a number of concepts for years to come, that they would keep the seat fixed, but the pedals would move, and that's how you would get comfortable inside the car. Never really made it through to production, although they did have adjustable pedals. Pontiac had adjustable foot pedals in the early and mid-1970s. Now, as we zoom in on the IP, you'll notice the steering wheel actually resembles what would come out on the Corvette in 1963, but here it is a year sooner. Of course, Larry Shinoda was also involved in that 1963 Corvette, and so he'd probably finished that up and then came over to doing this vehicle, and a few of those cues are clearly present in this, as well as cues from a later concept, the Mako Shark 2, particularly on the exterior. But you've got the speedometer on the right, the tachometer on the left, a series of driver-oriented gauges on the upper right there, and the key, obviously, off to the left. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because just like the front had that hinged canopy that tilted forward, the rear portion of the vehicle opens up and tilts rearward. You can kind of see it in the right-hand portion of the photo, and notice the exhausts that are flowing through it. But the astute observer will note that this isn't just a regular Corvair mounted rear engine vehicle. Why is that? Well, you'll see that drive belt, that funky drive belt that spins the fan on the Corvair and then goes over to the alternator and drives the accessories. And the engine is actually rotated 180 degrees from a normal Corvair. So what's going on here? This is actually a mid-engine car where the engine is forward of the rear wheels, as opposed to the Corvair, which was a rear-engine car. So the designers and the engineers of this particular vehicle also reoriented the engine to make it a true mid-engine spaceship-like vehicle where the engine is right behind, where the passengers sit. So I'm sure you got quite a thrill when you were driving this vehicle, hearing the noises that the engine made. And I love the battery tray there that's just kind of hanging out on the end away from the engine compartment. Pretty crazy. And here's a close-up of the exhaust system on the vehicle that flows through the rear portion of the body that's rotated upward. We'll see that in a second. And notice the independent rear suspension here is a distinctly different design than what was on the stock Corvair. So I guess they tried to do something a little bit different with the rear suspension, and probably had to because the engine, as I mentioned, was rotated 180 degrees. This was more of a mid-engine car versus a rear-engine car like the typical production Corvair was. Now let's take a look at what that body looks like when it's open from the rear. Man, that is just awesome. Notice you've got the fender bumps in the back, similar to the front. It's kind of like the 63 Stingrays type theme. You have 4 fender bumps. That's really the 63 Stingray, and that tapered rear end. Here, of course, it's a little bit less dramatic in terms of the taper than the Stingray, but you, of course, have those louvers that would make it onto other vehicles and concept cars like the Mako Shark 2 concept from GM. And here you can see that canopy in the front area rotated forward from the inside. And notice, like I said, that the underside of it looks like it's a sheet metal roof, but it's not. It's just painted. That's all that it is. Great illusion, if you will, to give the car this look that it has a roof that's distinct and different from the glass area. Now, with the body all closed up, we can see the rear view of this vehicle. And it has these beautiful haunches, those fender bumps as I was talking about them. You can see here clearly, as well as the louvered back window. And perhaps the most beautiful thing here is that clearance cove area that the taillights sit in. This would come about really for the 1965 Corvair revision. And you'd also find it on other General Motors cars like the Opel GT. So it had an international style, and this car was quite influential on GM design overall. This rear three-quarter view really shows a number of gorgeous styling elements of this vehicle. Take a look at those turbine vane wheels with the spinners. The spinners would become very popular in this time frame. These actually sit quite proud of the car, so better be watching out. You don't want these to cut into something. I love the way the exhaust is integrated into the quarter panel. And not only is the exhaust coming out of it, but there's a form that really sets up the exhaust exit just forward of the exhaust and kind of surrounding it. What a gorgeous detail. You can see that clearanced area for the taillights has some dimension to it and plan view. It's not just flat. It's kind of hard to pick up in the previous photos, but clearly it bows out around the edges and then gets thinner in the middle section. And I also love, notice in the front, the fender form, how it just gradually fades away at the back portion of the canopy where the cut line is before the new fender form is developed. That reflections in that area are just sublime. Beautiful surfacing on this car. And it goes to show you that GM really employed some great clay modelers during this time frame. Designers really are the individuals who sketch the cars and do so in 2D. But it's the clay modelers who are responsible for taking that two-dimensional sketch and putting it into reality. And GM had some of the best clay modelers during this time frame that were trained fine artists. And that, to me, is the sexiest area of this car, just how that front fender blends out at the cut line and the reflections that ensue as a result. Now we'll take a brief walk around of this car so you can see it up close and personal. Notice again those hidden headlamps. These are so-called alligator-style hidden headlamps. The top opened up and the bottom opened up as well. Take a look at the inset and you can see what I mean. And look at how wide that front is. And then it just tapers at the waist of the car. Something that, again, other vehicles would emulate during the time frame, but the fenders and the quarters are the widest part of the car. The midsection is relatively tapered. Gives the car an athletic feel, a so-called wasp waist-like vehicle. You can see that canopy with the crease in the middle very well here, that crease running all the way down the hood, all the way to the point, and those beautiful turbine vane wheels, as well as the air, let's say, inlets for the rear of the vehicle and for the engine to make sure that it's kept cool. As you rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, you can see that surface that I was mentioning there near the cut line of the canopy. and how it transitions and the reflections that are formed. And the rear quarter on this is just a gorgeous, gorgeous rear quarter, again, reminiscent of the Opel GT, as well as the Mako Shark 2 concept and even the Stingray that resulted from the Mako Shark 2. And as we rotate to this view, I keep getting thoughts of sharks. I mean, look at those air extractors that are just after the rear glass. Beautiful detail. And of course, sharks would be the motivation for that Mako Shark 2 concept that I mentioned. And the various sea creatures would obviously inspire the Stingray. So as we rotate back around to the front, what an awesome vehicle and a true styling tour de force from General Motors and two heavyweights of the time frame, Larry Shinoda as well as Tony Lapine. And one last little walk around of some finer details. You can see that roof portion is painted on there. You also notice the crease that I was mentioning in the middle of the windshield. A beautiful detail and just a gorgeous car overall. So what do you think of this Corvair Monza GT concept? Is this the Corvair that General Motors should have produced all along? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.